Hello and welcome back to the ILO's Future of Work podcast. I'm Rosalind Yard. This is the programme where we explore key issues in the world of work, and one of those big issues is discrimination, in particular racial discrimination. It seems we hear the buzzwords diversity and inclusion all the time, and the need to create more inclusive labour markets for all. But how does that reflect in workplaces? Is the overt racism of previous eras a thing of the past, or is there still much work to be done to achieve a level playing field in the world of work? The ILO has recently published a book called The Future of Diversity. It explores the biases and stereotypes that lead to discrimination and violence in workplaces and the policies that are needed to address structural inequalities. With me is one of the book's editors, Christiana Kupsch, Senior Specialist in Migration Policy at the ILO. Also with me is Marianne Lopez, Coordinator of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University, Montreal, Canada. Marianne is the co-author of one of the chapters in the book, which explores Black women's experiences in feminist workplaces. Christiana, Marianne, welcome. First, Christiana, according to an ILO report, about 1 in 4 workers worldwide is discriminated against in the workplace, with racial discrimination being one of the most common forms. How does racial discrimination manifest itself in the workplace?
Well, I think there are several ways. There are actually 3 main forms, but we also witness new forms. The 3 main forms are direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and structural discrimination. Direct discrimination is something where you have an intent, and in many legislations, you have sort of also a prohibited ground. Indirect discrimination takes place when there are harmful effects. It's less visible already. And structural discrimination is something where you have rules set up as a system. But since in many countries now we have legislation against discrimination that prohibits direct and open discrimination, at least, what we witness today is many more forms, much more subtle discriminations appearing all of a sudden. Microaggressions are one form, and we will surely discuss that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I was just about to ask you about that, Marianne, because in your chapter in this book, The Future of Diversity, you focus on Black women in feminist workplaces and also address the issue of violence in the workplace, which includes microaggressions. Can you explain, Marianne, what this actually means?
So in the context of Black women's experience, we talk about gendered and racial aggressions and how they intersect. So for us, microaggressions can be harmful comments or actions that usually target minority groups. So in our chapter, we address those that target Black women. And they're called microaggressions because they are usually normalized in the workplace. They're frequent and repeated, but they're not micro in their impact. They have proven to have very harmful impact on Black women's in Black women's life, mental health, physical health, etc.
So, can you give some examples? I know that in your chapter there are quite a few examples.
So, we interviewed several Black women in our research, and a lot of anecdotes came out of experience of microaggressions, such as comments about hair, skin, body figure, comments about Black men, addressing a Black woman as being scary or intimidating. So these are some of the examples that came up in our research.
That in fact reminds me of several instances in my own kind of experiences. And I know that I started a job once where I'd come with like 10 years of journalism behind me. And I kept being asked, you must be a trainee. I kept being told you must be a trainee. And I didn't understand what they were talking about. And in fact, I realized later that they were assuming that I'd come on a positive discrimination course. And I think the underlying thing was, well, maybe you don't deserve to be here. So, I mean, have you done research on the impact of these microaggressions on individuals, Marliane? And then I'll ask the same question to you, Christiana.
So the Black woman that participated in the research, all mentioned how these microaggressions, due to their frequency and the fact that they're normalized and rarely addressed, the impacts that they had on mental health, the impacts they had on physical health, and the ways that Black women find strategies to preserve their mental and physical health. And so, yeah, it came up a lot during the research. But unfortunately, there are limited resources even in the workplace to address these impacts.
What about you, Christiana? What have you found?
In some of the other chapters of The Future of Diversity, authors also mention how minority workers, if I may call them like this now, are discouraged and leave the places where they are abused. So this then has a scaring effect on their career. And yes, it will always keep them down, sort of. And of course, that, on the other hand, in turn, has an impact on inequalities or inequalities in the labor market, because this is the way how you perpetuate inequalities.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Marliane, you just mentioned about strategies. And I know something which I think is just become ingrained with me is that I meet a new group of people or whatever, I immediately go straight to them. I speak in a very direct manner. I look them in the eye, shake their hands. And I always make sure that they know a little bit about my background, which I drop into the conversation, just to kind of head them off at the pass, so to speak, so that they don't make assumptions about me, because I think that there are quite a few stereotypes about people of colour in the workplace. Have you maybe, Marliane, you can maybe unpick this idea of stereotypes and what we're talking about?
Yes, in the context of our chapter, we address stereotypes that affect Black women specifically. So, for example, the stereotype of the angry Black woman. So when a Black woman identifies a microaggression or a racist comment, if she addresses it or talks about it, sometimes she is perceived as being aggressive, as being angry. And so that really creates a barrier in terms of addressing racial harassment in the workplace. And another thing that I would like to bring up is a lot of times in policies around harassment in the workplace, there's nothing on racial harassment. And since it's not considered as being an offense or an aggression, a lot of times racial harassment in the workplace is not addressed. And what happens is in the context of the Black women that we interviewed, they would leave the workplace due to what we often identify as burnout, as professional burnout. But the reasons for this burnout are usually centered around racial harassment.
So why do you think, Christiana, that racial harassment doesn't appear to be addressed in the workplace? And we know there are lots of measures where we're talking about gender equality, for example. It's something we talk about a lot, which of course is very, very important. But why is it that it seems that there isn't so much a focus on racial discrimination or aggression? Is it because sometimes it's just really hard to pinpoint?
I suppose so. And I think this is linked as well to this new forms of racism, if you like. Everyone says, I am not a racist. And that's one form of a microaggression already, because usually I'm not a racist because blah, blah, blah. That already introduces a racist comment. But many people are not aware of the types of racist acts that they also commit on a daily basis in the workplace and elsewhere. If you take an example, let's say I'm working in a Hamburg enterprise, for instance, and I'm German. I look German in the sense, sort of talking about stereotypes again. I'm blonde with bright light eyes, and I'm asking my new black colleague, so where do you come from? And she says, I'm coming from Düsseldorf. And if I ended there, that might still be okay. But if then I continue, but where you really come from, where your parents do come from, etc., etc. There, I'm really portraying her as a foreigner, as someone other, and I'm really committing a microaggression. And many people do these things, and they absolutely not aware that they are doing this.
Yeah, because the underlying message is that, do you really belong
exactly
here?
And you don't if I continue asking those questions.
Yes, yeah. And I should say, I mean, I'm sure maybe it was the same for Marianne as well. Certainly when I was growing up in London, that was a question that was always asked me. Where are you from? And I'm from here. Where are you really from? Yeah. So I'm very familiar with that. And you mentioned, you're coming from Germany, and in fact, we've seen that there's been a report by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, and they revealed that discrimination on the grounds of race or ethnic origin is a widespread problem in the EU, with more than 1 in 3 respondents from an ethnic minority group reporting that they had experienced discrimination when looking for a job or in the workplace. So does this surprise you at all?
It does surprise me in some sense, and I find it utterly depressing. It does surprise me because we have been in the European Union, people have been working on sort of the topic for over 30 years now. The ILO had a first project combating discrimination against migrant and ethnic minority workers in the world of work as from the early 1990s. And that was quite interesting as a project because it was sort of relying on a methodology of situation testing, practice testing. You had 2 candidates, a minority-majority worker, both applying for the same job offer with sort of identical CVs. And then let's see what happens. And a large, huge discrimination was documented at the time. And I would have thought that in 30 years we would have made more progress than with the figures that you present me here with.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to go on to that about, previous generations, because like my parents' generation, racism in the workplace was much more overt. And I remember my father, who came to the UK or went to the UK in the 1950s and studied for many years, became an architect, worked in local council, wasn't getting any promotion at all. He was there for decades. So in the end, he applied to another council. He got the job. And then when he got the job, they complained. They said that, or they supposed that he'd got the job because he's black. And they actually launched an inquiry into his appointment, which meant that he was in limbo for quite a few months until they kind of looked at all his background and realised that he came with a lot of experience. So that was then, but now, have you seen, Marlianne? Do you think that things are actually improving? I know we don't have the same overt type of racism, but do you in your own research, have you seen any improvements at all? Or are you in the workplace?
So just to comment on the study, I'm not surprised at all. And I actually believe that the numbers are probably quite higher. And, a lot of folks are dissuaded to report or don't feel safe in disclosing experiences of discrimination. And for me, like we've mentioned a lot of microaggressions that could be considered as not systemic in nature, but it's important to also name systemic forms of racism and how, for example, minority groups, and in our case, Black women, Black populations, are have limited access to positions of leadership, for example, or how, for example, we did a lot of research around the community sector, how most of minority groups, racial minority groups, are hired in precarious positions or non-permanent position, contractual positions, and how they do not account for or are not represented in leadership positions. And so this is important to find out. There's also systemic forms of racism that are quite pervasive in the workplace, and how they manifest.
So what steps can employers and organizations take to promote diversity? I'll go to you first.
So I'm not really interested in diversity. I'm interested in anti-racism, because sprinkling a little bit diversity, that's why I believe we haven't really advanced in our struggle against systemic racism, because representativity is not the solution, like the sole solution. There needs to be action. There needs to be social transformation. And when we talk about work and organizations need to go under transformation, because we're talking about systemic forms of racism. And so just hiring one or two people of color is not going to address the systemic nature of racism in the workplace. And so for me, it's important to center equity. And, you center equity through programming that addresses the gaps in access, programming that promotes representativity in leadership roles, for example, and also programming that addresses the inequities in the workplace.
Interesting. What do you say about that, Christiana?
Yes, I fully agree. And I would like to highlight that some other chapter authors, Marie-Soleil Tremblay, Hanen Kremakem, and Patrice Gelina, they actually propose a few ways to overturn unconscious biases and strategies to value differences. They do this in relation to women in their chapter, but this also, of course, goes as tools for racism, I would say. For instance, they very much highlight that decisions are very often not taken, as we always say, on a rational basis, as standard economic theory would suggest. But decisions are very often taken with an instinct and not so rationally. So, and what you also have is that people tend to hire people who look like them, and of whom they think that they are alike. And that, of course, also never gives access to people of a different color. If the majority is white, then you have very likely white hires. And these authors, they try to give ideas on how to combat all these unconscious biases that we also have. And in, for example, suggesting that we could have that we could train our brains to positive associations, and that sort of sometimes mingling opportunities or informing peers about how someone in the group of a minority origin has done really great things for the enterprise, etc. That those kinds of things sort of would help much more than simply putting a strategy of a few people, as Marianne has said, a few people of sort of diverse backgrounds in the enterprise, without letting them also play the role which is in line with their education, for instance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a topic, we've been talking about for decades. It's not new. And I'm sure that some of these solutions have been, researched and suggested for some time. And I know there have been many, a gazillion reports, on racial discrimination in different work settings, be it the police, in schools, or healthcare. I mean, just wrapping up. I mean, do you believe? And I'll start with you, Christiana. But do you believe there will ever be real change? Or will, the research, will the reports, will they just gather in dust? Or I don't want to be pessimistic, but do you imagine that there'll be some change?
No, I would say that I would also not like to be pessimistic, and I would like to probably hope that all new knowledge is not futile. I think people need to be more aware, and people are not aware of these new forms of racism that have appeared. And I also believe that there is hope for the future in the sense that we are witnessing, after all, a new generation of people. This generation, I would hope, will link the concept of diversity much more with collaborating with people from different horizons, and that's a need, that it's not just an odd thing to do, but a need in something natural. And I see it with younger people.
Marliane, are you hopeful?
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I'm hopeful in the context of folks that are working, beyond diversity towards equity. Because like I stated before, we're talking about systemic forms of discrimination. And just by embracing diversity, we're not going to address the systemic forms, the historic forms of discrimination and the historic barriers that have affected minority groups in the workplace. So while is important to value diversity, it is insufficient in my opinion. There needs to be concrete work towards equity in order for, in the long term, in a sustainable way, minority groups benefit and are able to move and flourish, within the workplace.
Yeah, diversity and inclusion have to go hand in hand. I mean, that's also one of the main messages of the future of diversity. Fully agree with you, Marliane, there.
Thank you so much, Christiana and Marliane. I think we could go on talking for much, much longer, but we're going to have to wrap up there. So thank you so much for joining us today and for shedding light on such an important issue. And to find out more about this and about broader issues of discrimination in the workplace, you can find links to the book, The Future of Diversity, on the webpage of this podcast and on the ILO website. Until the next time, goodbye.